Subscribe, like, and comment now. Because some stories don't just haunt the people inside them, they haunt everyone who hears them. The first police cruiser reached the salvage yard just as the winter light began to fade. Red and blue flashes sliced through the cold Wisconsin air, bouncing off rusted car doors, shattered windshields, and piles of scrap metal stacked like silent witnesses. The place felt wrong even before anyone stepped out of the vehicle. It was too quiet, too still. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears and tells you something terrible has already happened. Officers moved carefully through the yard, boots crunching on frozen gravel. A burned-out vehicle sat near the edge of the property, its metal frame blackened and warped. Investigators would later say the smell lingered there, smoke, oil, and something else they couldn't immediately identify. What they knew, even before the forensic teams arrived, was that a young woman was missing, and this place had become the center of the storm. Her name was Teresa Halbach. Within hours, the salvage yard transformed into a full-scale crime scene. Floodlights lit up the darkness. Yellow tape fluttered in the wind. Cameras clicked. Radios crackled with urgency. Every discovery seemed to deepen the mystery instead of solving it. A key found in an unexpected place. A bone fragment near a burn pit. A trail of questions that led not outward, but inward, toward the people who lived and worked on the property. The investigation quickly zeroed in on one man, Stephen Avery. His name spread fast, whispered by officers, repeated by reporters, and etched into headlines before the evidence had fully settled. Avery was no stranger to the justice system. His past, controversial and complicated, made him an easy target in the public eye. But while the spotlight burned hot on Stephen Avery, someone else stood just beyond its reach, barely visible in the shadows. His name was Brendan Dassey. Brendan was 16 years old. He was quiet, awkward, and painfully unsure of himself. Teachers described him as slow to speak. Classmates barely noticed him. He lived a small life on the edges of louder personalities, spending his days at school and his evenings playing video games in a cluttered bedroom. He was Stephen Avery's nephew, and that connection alone would pull him into a nightmare he didn't understand and couldn't escape. At first, Brendan wasn't considered important. He wasn't a suspect. He wasn't even a person of interest. He was just a kid who lived nearby, someone officers believed might know something, anything, about what had happened in the salvage yard. That belief would change everything. The interrogation room was small and windowless. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A camera blinked red, recording every word. Brendan sat at the table, shoulders slumped, eyes darting between the two men across from him. They were calm, friendly. Their voices were soft, almost reassuring. They told him they were there to help. They told him the truth was the only way forward. They told him that honesty would set him free. Brendan nodded. He wanted to go home. What followed would become one of the most controversial interrogations in modern American criminal history. The officers asked questions, then asked them again, slightly differently. When Brendan's answers didn't fit, they guided him. When he hesitated, they reassured him. When he said he didn't know, they told him it was okay to guess. They spoke in hypotheticals, in suggestions, in half-finished sentences that Brendan seemed expected to complete. Be honest, they said. Tell us what really happened, they said. You'll be okay if you just tell the truth, they said. Hour after hour passed. Brendan's words grew more uncertain, more fragmented. He repeated phrases back to them. He corrected himself. He apologized. He looked down at his hands. He asked if he could go back to school. At one point, according to the recording, he asked a simple question that would echo for years. Am I going to be able to go home? The answer he received wasn't clear. It never was. What Brendan eventually said in that room shocked everyone who heard it. He described events that aligned, in pieces, with what investigators believed had happened. He used language that seemed beyond his years, then struggled to explain basic details. Some answers came only after repeated prompting. Others contradicted known facts. To the officers, it was a confession. To Brendan, it felt like the end of a test he desperately wanted to pass. By the time he left the room, The case had changed forever. News of the confession spread fast. The public reaction was immediate and brutal. Headlines declared the mystery solved. Commentators spoke with certainty. The narrative locked into place. The crime had been committed, and the people responsible were finally talking. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. Brendan returned to his normal routine, or at least what passed for normal now. School felt different. Whispers followed him down hallways. Teachers watched him closely. His family was confused, frightened, and overwhelmed. Brendan himself seemed unsure of what he had done or said. In later recorded calls, he spoke about homework, video games, and his upcoming classes, as if the world hadn't just branded him a killer. Investigators, however, pressed forward. They returned to the salvage yard, armed with Brendan's statements. They searched again and again. Every shovel in the dirt, every sweep of a flashlight, carried the weight of expectation. If the confession was real, the evidence had to be there. Some things were found. Some things were not. Experts would later debate what those findings meant, and whether they supported Brendan's account or contradicted it. But at the time, nuance didn't matter. Momentum did. And the momentum was unstoppable. Brendan was arrested. The image of him in custody, small, confused, drowning in an adult system, would become iconic. He looked nothing like the monster described in court filings and media reports. He looked like a kid who had wandered into a place he didn't belong and didn't know how to leave. His family watched in disbelief as the charges were read. They asked questions no one could fully answer. How could a boy like Brendan commit such acts? How could he understand the consequences of what he'd said? Why hadn't a lawyer been present? Why hadn't a parent been in the room? Those questions would grow louder over time, but for now, they were drowned out by the roar of a system already in motion. Behind closed doors, prosecutors prepared their case. Investigators reviewed hours of interrogation footage. Defense attorneys began the slow, uphill battle of trying to explain something that felt impossible to explain. How a confession could exist without clarity, without consistency, without certainty. And somewhere in the middle of it all sat Brendan Dassey, waiting. Waiting for answers. Waiting for someone to explain what was happening. Waiting to go home. The public believed they knew the truth. The courts prepared to decide his fate. But there was something buried deep within the recordings, something subtle and unsettling, something that would eventually force people to ask an uncomfortable question. What if the confession wasn't the end of the mystery, but the beginning of a much darker one? Because when experts later slowed the tapes down, listened word by word, and traced how each detail emerged, they noticed something chilling. The most critical parts of Brendan's story didn't come from him at all. And when the interrogation transcript revealed exactly how those details entered the room, everything people thought they knew about the case began to unravel. But the most disturbing revelation hadn't surfaced yet. That would come later, when the court examined what the officers promised Brendan, what he believed those promises meant, and what he thought would happen when he finally told them what they wanted to hear. And when that truth came out, it would force the world to confront a question that still has no easy answer. Did Brendan Dassey confess to a crime? Or did he confess because he believed it was the only way he could go home? The confession didn't end the investigation. It ignited it. By the time Brendan Dassey's words reached the prosecution team, the case had taken on a life of its own. What had once been a missing person investigation was now framed as a solved murder, complete with a narrative that felt disturbingly neat. A crime scene, a primary suspect, and now a confession from a teenage accomplice. In the eyes of the system, the puzzle pieces were finally locking together. But beneath that confidence, the ground was already shifting. Brendan sat alone in a holding cell, the cold seeping through concrete walls that smelled of disinfectant and metal. He didn't fully understand what was happening to him. He asked guards when he could go home. He asked his mother the same question during monitored phone calls, his voice cracking as he tried to make sense of the words being used against him. "I told them what they wanted," he said. "They said I'd be okay." Those calls would later become haunting evidence, not of guilt, but of confusion. While Brendan waited, prosecutors moved fast. They reconstructed the crime using his statements, layering them over physical evidence already collected. Where the story didn't fit, they adjusted the interpretation. Where details were missing, they argued they were too horrific for a boy to fully articulate. The narrative hardened. According to the state, Brendan had played a role in a brutal crime. They described actions in chilling detail, painting him not as a passive bystander, but as an active participant. The words echoed through court filings, press conferences, and news broadcasts, shaping public perception long before a jury would ever be seated. The public recoiled. How could a 16-year-old be capable of such things? And yet, how could he not be, if he had confessed? That contradiction became the heart of the case. Brendan was appointed a defense team, but the damage was already deep. The confession, recorded, replayed, dissected, loomed over everything. In American courtrooms, confessions carry enormous weight. Jurors are taught, implicitly and explicitly, that people don't admit to crimes they didn't commit. But Brendan's lawyers saw something else when they watched the tapes. They saw a boy who mirrored authority figures, a boy who guessed when he didn't know, a boy who changed answers to please the adults in the room. They saw leading questions. They saw pressure disguised as reassurance. They saw a process that seemed designed not to uncover the truth, but to extract agreement. They filed motions to suppress the confession, arguing it was coerced and unreliable. They pointed to Brendan's age, his cognitive limitations, the absence of a parent or attorney, the repeated promises, spoken or implied, that honesty would lead to freedom. The court listened, and then it said no. The judge ruled that the confession would stand. That decision sealed Brendan's fate in ways no one fully grasped at the time. As the trial approached, the atmosphere grew heavier. Reporters lined courthouse steps. Cameras followed every movement. The case was no longer just about Teresa Halbach's death. It had become a referendum on justice itself. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution laid out its version of events with precision and confidence. They spoke of timelines, locations, and actions as if they were undisputed facts. Brendan's confession was presented as the backbone of the case, the piece that explained everything else. Jurors watched the interrogation footage. They saw Brendan hesitate. They heard him say, "I don't know," again and again. They watched investigators steer him back on course. Some jurors leaned forward, trying to decide whether they were witnessing guilt or vulnerability. The defense countered with experts. Psychologists testified about false confessions, explaining how juveniles are especially susceptible to suggestion and authority. They described how stress, fear, and a desire to please can override truth. They explained how a young mind, trapped in an unfamiliar and intimidating environment, might say anything to escape. But the prosecution had a simple rebuttal. Why would he confess if it wasn't true? That question hung in the air like a verdict waiting to be delivered. As the trial unfolded, another disturbing issue emerged. Parts of Brendan's confession didn't match the physical evidence. Some details were wrong. Some locations showed no forensic support. Some acts he described left no trace where traces should have existed. Instead of raising doubt, prosecutors reframed those inconsistencies as proof of trauma. He's a child, they argued. Of course his memory isn't perfect. It was a powerful argument, and a dangerous one, because it meant the confession could never be wrong, only incomplete. Outside the courtroom, public opinion was deeply divided. Some believed Brendan was a cold-blooded killer hiding behind youth and innocence. Others saw him as a victim of a system that mistook compliance for guilt. Documentarians began to take notice. Legal scholars whispered concerns. Civil rights advocates watched closely, uneasy with what they were seeing. But Brendan remained where he had always been, silent, small, and overwhelmed. When the verdict finally came, it arrived with devastating finality. Guilty. The words landed like a physical blow. Brendan stood as the sentence was read, his face blank, his body rigid. He was condemned to spend decades behind bars, most of his life, for a crime he still struggled to articulate. As he was led away, his family wept. His mother screamed. Brendan didn't say a word. Prison swallowed him whole. The days blurred together in concrete hallways and locked doors. Brendan learned routines meant for men twice his age. He learned when to speak and when to stay quiet. He learned how to disappear. But the story didn't end there. Because while Brendan adjusted to life inside, the outside world began to change. Years later, a documentary series would emerge, peeling back the layers of a case and exposing the interrogation tapes in full. Millions of viewers watched Brendan's confession for the first time, unedited and unfiltered. And what they saw disturbed them. They saw the questions. They saw the pauses. They saw the moments where answers were supplied, not recalled. Public outrage followed. Petitions circulated. Legal appeals were filed. Experts revisited the evidence with fresh eyes. Courts were forced to reconsider whether justice had truly been served, or whether it had failed in one of the most irreversible ways possible. Brendan's case climbed through the appeal system inch by inch. One court ruled in his favor, calling the confession involuntary. Hope surged. Then another court overturned that ruling. Hope vanished. The system closed ranks. And Brendan remained behind bars. But the most shocking development was still ahead. Because as lawyers dug deeper, they uncovered something that reframed everything. The psychology of the interrogation itself, and the precise moment where Brendan's fate may have been decided long before he ever spoke the words that condemned him. A moment where going home was dangled like a reward. A moment where truth became secondary to compliance. And when that moment was finally understood, it raised a terrifying possibility. What if Brendan Dassey didn't just lose his freedom? What if he lost it because he trusted the wrong people at the worst possible time? Years passed, but time inside prison moved differently. For Brendan Dassey, it stretched endlessly, measured not in days, but in locked doors, metal echoes, and the quiet realization that childhood was gone forever. He entered prison as a confused teenager. He grew into adulthood behind bars, surrounded by men serving sentences for crimes they openly admitted to committing. Brendan remained different. He never talked about what he had done, because deep down he still didn't understand what the world believed he had done. Outside those walls, however, the story refused to die. When the documentary series brought Brendan's interrogation into millions of living rooms, something shifted. Viewers didn't see a monster. They saw a boy nodding along, agreeing, guessing, and searching for approval. They saw the exact moment when the promise of freedom, spoken plainly or implied, became the most powerful weapon in the room. Public outrage exploded. Law professors replayed the footage in classrooms. Psychologists paused frames to explain compliance and suggestibility. Former detectives admitted the interrogation raised red flags. Comment sections filled with disbelief and anger. How could this be allowed? Why wasn't there a lawyer? Why didn't someone stop this? For the first time, Brendan's voice, quiet and uncertain, was being heard. His legal team seized the moment. They returned to court armed with expert testimony, scientific studies, and the undeniable fact that juveniles are uniquely vulnerable during interrogations. They argued that Brendan's confession wasn't just unreliable. It was the product of psychological pressure so subtle and persistent that even trained adults might have cracked under it. In a stunning decision, a federal judge agreed. The ruling declared Brendan's confession involuntary. The language was sharp, unmistakable. The court described the interrogation as coercive, pointing to repeated assurances that honesty would lead to going home. The judge acknowledged Brendan's age, his intellectual limitations, and the imbalance of power in that room. For a moment, it felt like justice had finally arrived. Brendan's family celebrated cautiously. Supporters cried. Headlines declared that freedom was within reach. After more than a decade, Brendan might finally step outside as a free man. But the system was not finished. The state appealed. And in a deeply divided decision, a higher court reversed the ruling. The confession was reinstated. The logic was chilling in its simplicity. The investigators hadn't explicitly promised freedom, the court said. Brendan's interpretation of their words, his hope, his trust, did not legally matter. With that ruling, the door slammed shut. Once again, Brendan was reduced to a legal argument rather than a human being. His future hinged not on truth, but on technicalities. The Supreme Court declined to hear the case. There would be no final appeal, no dramatic release, no apology. Brendan remained in prison, serving a sentence that would outlast his youth, his prime, and potentially his life. And yet, even in defeat, the case had changed something fundamental. Law enforcement agencies across the country quietly updated interrogation policies. Some jurisdictions began requiring lawyers for juveniles. Others mandated recorded interviews from start to finish. Training programs were rewritten, using Brendan's confession as a cautionary example. His loss became a lesson. But lessons do not undo time. Brendan spent birthdays behind bars. He watched family members age during brief, supervised visits. He learned about the world through secondhand stories and outdated magazines. Technology advanced without him. Life moved on. And still, one question lingered, haunting everyone who studied the case. What if Brendan had never been questioned alone? What if someone had explained his rights in a way he truly understood? What if the desire to close a case hadn't outweighed the responsibility to protect a child? Those questions had no satisfying answers. The official record would always say Brendan Dassey confessed. History, however, began telling a different story. Not of guilt, but of vulnerability. Not of evil, but of trust misplaced. Not of justice served, but of a system that mistook obedience for truth. Today, Brendan remains incarcerated. His case is cited around the world as a warning about how easily the line between investigation and coercion can blur, and how devastating the consequences can be when it does. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic courtroom reversal, no moment where the truth burst free and set everything right. Just silence. Silence where a childhood should have been. Silence where freedom was promised. Silence where a simple question echoes endlessly. If a child confesses because he believes it will let him go home, is that a confession at all? And as the prison doors close once more behind Brendan Dassey, one thing becomes painfully clear. The truth did come out. It just came too late. If this story shook you, stay close. The next one goes even deeper into the shadows. Hit subscribe, because some truths refuse to stay buried.